welcome back. Today I wanted to talk about religion and spirituality. It's been a big topic as part of my research in school, and I kind of wanted to go in depth into what it means to be religious, what it means to be spiritual, and to talk about the difference between the two of those. There's an article by the Pew Research Center. They do a lot of different surveys, cultural, social, they do a lot of different research in that regard. There was an article in 2017 that studied the religious and spiritual beliefs of people in the United States, and they found that over 27%, more than a quarter of US adults consider themselves spiritual but not religious. Given that it's a topic that I've studied at Columbia at the graduate research level, I kind of wanted to go into depth and talk about what it means to be spiritual, what it means to be religious. So let's start with religion. Like, what does it mean to be religious? And as commonly understood, being religious means belonging to an established religious tradition. So that may involve prayer, ritual, organized group meetings, an established religious structure that provides sort of guidance and scaffolding for your beliefs. So, an organized religion may have certain tenets, certain moral code that they follow. There can be billions of followers, like in Christianity, Hinduism. There are, billions of followers around the world, or it can be a smaller group, whether in the millions, whether in the tens of thousands. Buddhism, for example, has 500 million, so that's still a lot of people, but it's not as much as like Christianity or Hinduism. That would be religious. That would be considered a religious practice, as opposed to being more spiritual. So spirituality is more about personal and individual beliefs and practices. It can be within an established religion, or it can be, more typically, it's considered outside of a traditional religious structure. As we said before in the Pew Research, more and more US adults are considering themselves spiritual but not religious, outside of an organized group or outside of an organized setting. The spiritual person really believes they are in charge of their own spiritual development and personal growth. They can usually draw on the practices and beliefs of a lot of different belief systems, studying a lot of different cultures, a lot of different practices, and taking what's useful to them and using that for their own development. So usually in a spiritual tradition, or if you consider yourself a spiritual person, you do things like maybe meditation, yoga. Maybe you do pray. You don't consider yourself a religious person now, but you consider yourself a spiritual person. And so maybe you still occasionally go to church or temple, but it's not really the large dominant force that it was before. So really the spiritual person believes that organized religion is not really for them. They sort of have grown beyond the structure or the organized aspect and sort of taking it as a rugged individualist approach. Maybe they do have meditation groups or yoga groups they participate in, but they also largely hold themselves accountable and hold themselves to their individual practice. In the courses that I've taken on spirituality and religion and sort of distinguishing the two, it started with the Transcendentalist movement of Emerson. So Ralph Waldo Emerson was an author, a poet, and a writer. He advocated for a more experiential and intuitive sense of spirituality and connection to nature, and so a lot of his poetry reflected that connection to nature, but outside of the traditional dogmatic religious practices of his time period. That was heavily influenced by the Romantic period. European Romanticism was an artistic and literary movement of the 18th century that focused on a return to connection to nature and connection to community and culture and things like that. One question that a lot of people have is like, what's the difference? What's the difference between spirituality and religion? And really, it's just the organized aspect, a large group setting, a large population of people and culture and community. And spirituality is more the individual aspect. So one question that people have is, can you be spiritual and not religious? If you're spiritual and not religious, as the Pew survey identified, that more people in the US at least are considering themselves spiritual but not religious. And so that really means to take your own spirituality and your own practices upon yourself. You are in charge of your own spiritual destiny, in charge of your own path and journey, and that journey may be very different from what other people's journey looks like. It's really personal and individual, and what that looks like for me can be different for you, can be different for another person, can be different than the religious person. And so it can vary a lot. There's a lot of self-study, a lot of searching. You can use like the journey metaphor, a spiritual journey or spiritual path is center stage for the spiritual person. But on the flip side, can you be religious but not spiritual? I think that's a really interesting question, and some opinions can vary. In my view, I think it's very possible to be religious but not spiritual. Growing up Catholic and going to Catholic schools and going to church when I was very young, I'm sure many of you can relate to that, growing up in a household where your family goes to church every Sunday. I would see a lot of people my age that would go to church just because their family went to church. They really just did it out of habit and out of family tradition, and they really weren't tied into the meaning and the depth of that practice. They really weren't connected. It was just sort of going through the motions. They didn't believe what they were practicing, and I would argue that that's a more religious but not spiritual aspect. But you can definitely be religious and spiritual. I know a lot of people that it plays a really pivotal part of their life. They're really in touch with their own spirituality, really compassionate, really involved with helping others. And I think that that's, the best of the religious mindset, the people that really are devout and really believe what they're preaching. But of course, one of the criticisms of religion is that the people, preach but don't practice, really say they believe one thing but don't follow through with it. And so, sadly, that is the case with a lot of people that, they aren't the best representatives of their faith. That's still one major challenge. So what does it mean to be a spiritual person? What does it mean to be a religious person? I think it's really up to the individual. The Pew Research article that I'm referencing, and I'll have a link in the description, is really just getting to the heart of the changing beliefs and the changing dynamics of our culture and our society. I think a lot of people like the individual aspect, like taking that upon themselves to be responsible for their own development, their own growth. Speaking as a student of literature and psychology, I think one of the most beneficial things that I see in psychology and in that practice is that it has people take responsibility for themselves. It takes that journey mindset. It takes that growth mindset of you're constantly a work in progress. There's always something that you can improve upon for your own life. And I think the spiritual mindset definitely taps into that. I think there's been a lot of research that shows the benefits of things like meditation, things like prayer, community, being in a group setting and practicing with other people. So there can definitely be benefits for both spirituality and religion. As for myself, growing up in a religious household, growing up Catholic, I would go to church every Sunday. I think I've shifted to a more spiritual mindset where I take responsibility for my own growth, my own development, and it's a process. I think things like meditation have been beneficial for myself. Doing research at the graduate level at Columbia in things like meditation and spiritual practice, our studies have shown that there's a lot of benefits in terms of mental health and well-being. Things like self-confidence, things like personal growth and development. A lot of younger people are moving away from more traditional religious practices and traditional religious beliefs and moving towards a more spiritual mindset. This video is basically just to kind of explain the difference of the two. I think there's a lot of misconceptions and a lot of questions surrounding this topic. Of course, when you're talking about things like religion, like spirituality, it can be controversial, but I don't think it has to be. Religion is an important part of a lot of people's lives, but for many people in the world now, it's becoming less and less so. You can still have a spiritual mindset. You can still have a growth mindset outside of a traditional religious, paradigm. I think everybody's different. Everybody's in a different place in their life and has a different path. And some people need the structure and organization that can be beneficial. But I think other people like to take their own path and take their own journey. And I think it just depends on the individual. There's a lot of other factors as well. If you're coming from a religious family, maybe that's going to be a big influence, and it can be hard to break away from that. Or maybe you grew up in a household that was more agnostic or atheist, and so you're searching for a spiritual path outside of a traditional religion. I think that happens to a lot of people as well. And so it really depends on your own path and your own journey and to find what's right for you. There can be some criticisms about spirituality from traditional religious sources. Just doing the research for this video, several religious clergy people have said that spirituality can be like religious tourism. You're just adopting practices from one thing or another thing and sort of taking it out of the context in which it was originally placed. So some people may think of that as disrespectful or picking and choosing what works for you. Some people have criticized it as being spiritually commercial or spiritual commercialism, where people are capitalizing and profiting off of taking these different religious practices out of context and just using it for your own benefit. And I think that that's one challenge that we're seeing today. How do you live authentically? How do you live spiritually? How do you live consciously in a spiritual lifestyle that is aware of and respectful of those practices? Another criticism is that people that are spiritual are just being lazy, that they're sort of not really doing the work and investigative work, and I think that's really an unfair criticism. I think the spiritual person that's serious about their own growth and development really does a lot of research and takes the time to find what works for them. As somebody that does meditation, that does prayer, that does spiritual practices, it does take a lot of time and research. I mean, like years of your life trying to find what's best for you, what works for you. Sometimes you find something, whether that's yoga, whether that's meditation. Not everything is for everybody, and so it takes a lot of time to find what's right for you. And so I think that's really an unfair criticism that people say if you're spiritual, you're just, being lazy or you're not really taking it seriously. I think on the contrary, when it's your own individual path and your own journey, and you're taking that responsibility upon yourself and not relying on the structure or scaffolding of a traditional religion, I think that can be more challenging. I mean, it's going to take years to find what works for you, and you're constantly in development. And I think that can be true for religious people as well, but I think for the spiritual person even more so that's a challenge. So I hope this video was helpful. I hope this spurs a good discussion about what it means to be spiritual, what it means to be religious, what's the difference of the two. I think a lot of people use the terms spiritual versus religion or spiritual not religious, but they don't have to be mutually exclusive. I think the two go hand in hand. But again, it's up to the individual person as well. Are you a religious person? Are you a spiritual person? Or are you neither? Are you more, a skeptic? Are you more questioning? It's always good to question things. It's always good to do research. It's always good to find out more. So, hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you next time. Bye.